Ancestral Land Curse, The Price of Greed and Dark Powers. Episode 1. In a small, seemingly peaceful village, a family returns to their ancestral home, determined to build a grand mausoleum for their ancestors. Jack and his brothers, now wealthy and powerful, aim to buy a plot of land known for its exceptional energy flow, a site said to hold prosperity for generations. But the land is already owned by Mr. Tung, a man whose family has thrived on it for years, a source of deep jealousy for Jack's family. Desperate to secure the land, Jack and his brothers attempt to negotiate with Mr. Tung, only to face rejection. In a twist of fate, Jack seeks the dark assistance of an old sorcerer, hoping to curse Mr. Tung and his family into giving up the land. What follows is a terrifying series of supernatural events, mysterious accidents, ominous figures, and blood-curdling encounters with dark forces ensue. Mr. Tung's family becomes the target of violent hauntings as a sinister entity slowly tightens its grip around their lives. The tension escalates, reaching a horrifying climax when Jack realizes that dark magic cannot be easily controlled and the curse may destroy more than he ever intended. Part 1. The Quest for Ancestral Land. The sun was setting behind the mountains when Jack and his brothers returned to the village. It had been years since they last set foot in this remote, quiet place. Now they stood on the outskirts, gazing over the fields and hills that once were home. A strange sense of nostalgia washed over Jack, but he was quickly overwhelmed by a gnawing desire, a desire that had grown stronger with every mile of their journey back. Jack clenched his fists, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The ancestral land. That was why they had come back. It wasn't just about sentiment or family tradition. This land held something far more valuable. The whispers of old men and the village elders had always hinted at its significance. The plot of land owned by Mr. Tung was said to be blessed with ancient energy, the kind that could change the fate of an entire lineage. For generations, their ancestors had scattered across this region, their graves laid haphazardly, some in forgotten corners of the village. Their family, once poor and destitute, had finally risen to wealth and power. Now, the brothers wanted to consolidate their family's presence, to build a grand ancestral shrine that would house their forefathers and, more importantly, bring fortune to their descendants. But the key to this grand vision was the land, and it was owned by Tung, a stubborn old man who had no intention of selling. Jack's younger brother, Lucas, broke the silence as they made their way to the village center. "Do you think he'll sell, Jack?" he asked, his voice tinged with anxiety. Jack didn't respond immediately, his mind racing. Tung had refused every offer they had made so far, no matter how generous. And yet this land, this specific piece of earth, was essential. The energy flowing through it, the Feng Shui, was perfect, cradled between the mountains and the river. It was the only place where the ancestral shrine could be built, ensuring the prosperity of their family for generations. "Here's to Jack," muttered finally, his voice low and hard. "He has no choice." Lucas glanced nervously at their youngest brother Mark, who had been unusually quiet. Mark had always been the sensitive one, prone to superstition and strange premonitions. His face was pale, and his eyes darted toward the distant woods where Tung's land lay. "It's cursed," Mark said softly, his voice barely audible. "That land, there's something wrong with it." Jack shot him a sharp look, annoyance flaring in his chest. "Don't start with that nonsense, Mark. We're not here to listen to ghost stories. This is about our family's future." But even as he said the words, Jack couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled over him the moment they set foot in the village. The land they sought, that patch of earth, had a history, an ancient one. The villagers spoke of it in hushed tones, as if afraid that merely mentioning it would summon something dark. They said it had once been the site of strange rituals, and that those who tried to disturb the balance there often met with misfortune. Jack, of course, didn't believe in such things. He was a man of reason, of wealth and power, and wealth and power came from action, not from superstition. By the time the brothers reached Tung's house, the sky had darkened, casting long shadows across the village. The house itself was modest but well kept, sitting at the edge of the land they coveted. Jack paused, taking a deep breath before knocking on the door. It opened slowly, revealing Mr. Tung, an old man with sharp, calculating eyes. He didn't look surprised to see them, as if he had been expecting this visit. "You're here again," Tung said, his voice gravelly and thin. He stepped aside, letting them into the house without a word of welcome. Jack wasted no time. "We're here to talk about the land," Mr. Tommy said firmly, stepping inside. "We've made you a generous offer more than fair. You know as well as we do that this land is of no use to you." Tung's face remained unreadable as he moved slowly across the room. "The land is mine," he said, his voice steady. "It has been in my family for generations, and it will remain with us." Frustration flared in Jack's chest, and he fought to keep his temper in check. "We understand that it has sentimental value, but it's not about sentiment," Tom interrupted, his eyes narrowing. "It's about something far deeper. You think you can come back here with your money and your grand plans and take what doesn't belong to you. But this land, it is bound to me, and you cannot have it." A cold silence settled over the room. Jack exchanged glances with his brothers. They had expected resistance, but not this. There was something in Tong's tone, something final and unyielding, that made Jack's skin crawl. Lucas shifted uncomfortably beside him. "Mr. Tong, we're prepared to make you an even better offer. Name your price, and we'll—" "There is no price," Tong said firmly, his gaze locking onto Jack's. "And no amount of money will change my mind. This land, it is not for sale." Jack's hands clenched into fists, his knuckles turning white. How could this man be so stubborn? Did he not understand the opportunity he was passing up? They could build something grand, something that would honor the village and bring prosperity to everyone. But Tung, with his old world beliefs and superstitions, was standing in their way. "You're making a mistake," Jack said, his voice low and dangerous. "We're offering you a way out, a chance to live comfortably for the rest of your days. If you don't take it, you might regret it." Tong's lips curled into a faint, knowing smile. "It's not me who will regret this." Before Jack could respond, Tong turned and walked to the door, opening it wide. "Now, if you're done here, I suggest you leave for a moment." Jack considered pushing further, demanding that Tong reconsider. But something in the old man's eyes made him hesitate. There was a darkness there, a quiet power that Jack hadn't noticed before. Without another word, Jack turned and left, his brothers following close behind. As they walked away from Tong's house, Jack's mind raced. This wasn't over. He would find a way to get that land, no matter what it took. Later that night, Jack sat alone by the fire, staring into the flames as they flickered and danced. His brothers had gone to bed, but sleep was far from his mind. He couldn't stop thinking about Tong's words, about the strange way he had spoken about the land. "It's bound to me," what did that even mean? Jack had heard stories everyone in the village had, stories of spirits and curses, of ancient rituals that had taken place long before their time. But those were just stories, weren't they? Mere folklore, passed down through generations to scare children. And yet, there was something about Tong's demeanor that had unsettled Jack. It wasn't just stubbornness. It was as if the old man knew something they didn't. Suddenly, the flames in the hearth flickered wildly, casting airy shadows across the room. Jack's heart skipped a beat as the temperature seemed to drop, the air around him growing colder. He stood up, his pulse quickening, and moved closer to the fire, trying to shake off the sudden chill. As he reached out to stoke the flames, a whisper, a faint, almost imperceptible voice seemed to rise from the hearth, swirling with the smoke. "Leave it alone," Jack froze, his hand hovering above the fire. His breath caught in his throat as the voice repeated, louder this time, "Leave the land." Alone, a cold shiver ran down Jack's spine, and he stumbled backward, his eyes wide with fear. He glanced around the room, but there was no one there, just him and the crackling fire. For the first time since returning to the village, Jack felt a deep sense of dread settle over him. Something was wrong. Part 2. the warning of the Feng Shui master. The brothers sat in a dimly lit room, the heavy scent of incense curling through the air. The faint light from a single lantern flickered, casting long, airy shadows on the walls. Jack, Lucas, and Mark sat in silence, their eyes fixed on the old man seated across from them. The Feng Shui master, Master Han, wore a faded robe, his eyes hidden beneath bushy grey eyebrows that seemed to weigh heavily on his face. His presence filled the room with an air of mystery and ancient wisdom. Master Han had not spoken for several minutes. Instead, he had been carefully studying a large, intricately drawn map of the village that Jack had spread out on the table. His fingers traced the lines and curves with deliberate slowness, his lips moving silently, as if reciting some ancient chant. Occasionally he would pause, his eyes narrowing in concentration, before resuming his quiet inspection of the map. The brothers waited anxiously. They had heard of Master Han's reputation, a man who understood the secret language of the earth, a man who could read the flow of energy through the land. If anyone could tell them what they needed to know about the land they sought, it was him. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Master Han spoke. This land, his voice was soft, almost a whisper, yet it carried the weight of something far greater. The land you seek is special, very special. Jack leaned forward, his heart pounding in his chest. What do you mean? Special? Master Han's eyes lifted slowly to meet Jack's, and for a moment it felt as though the old man could see straight into his soul. It is not merely a plot of earth. It is a convergence point where energies from the mountain and the river meet. Such a place is rare, very rare. The energy here is powerful, ancient, and untamed. It holds the potential to bring great fortune or great destruction. Lucas, always the more practical one, furrowed his brow. Fortune or destruction? That sounds like something out of a legend. We just want to build a shrine to honor our ancestors. Master Han shook his head slowly, his expression grave. You misunderstand. A place like this is alive. It breathes, it pulses with energy, and it reacts to the intentions of those who use it. If you build your shrine there, it will amplify the fortune of your family for generations. Your descendants will prosper, their businesses will thrive, and their names will be known far beyond this village. Jack felt a surge of excitement rise in his chest. This was exactly what they needed to hear. The ancestral shrine they planned to build wasn't just a symbol, it would be the foundation of their family's legacy. The power of the land would elevate them, securing their place among the wealthiest and most influential families in the region. But then, Master Han's voice dropped lower and his tone darkened. However, he continued, this land is not without its dangers. It is older than any of us. There are forces at work here that none of us can fully understand. If the land is misused, if it is disturbed or taken with impure intentions, it could bring ruin. The same energy that can lift your family up could just as easily tear it apart. A cold chill ran down Jack's spine. For a moment, he was reminded of Tung's ominous words, "It's bound to me." Was there something deeper, something darker at play here? He glanced at his brothers, who looked equally unsettled by Master Han's warning. Mark, the youngest, spoke up, his voice hesitant. What kind of dangers are you talking about, Master Han? We've heard stories, rumors about the land. People say it's cursed, that bad things happen to those who try to take it. Master Han's eyes flickered with something unreadable. Was it fear or respect for the power of the land? There are always stories, he said quietly. Some say that the spirits of the land's ancient guardians still linger, protecting it from those who would misuse its power. Others say that dark rituals were once performed there, rituals that left a stain on the earth itself. But the truth is, none of us know for certain. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the weight of ancient secrets that seemed to press down on the brothers. Jack felt a knot of unease form in his stomach. They had come here for answers, for confirmation that this land would bring them the success they desired. And while Master Han had confirmed its power, he had also introduced a new layer of uncertainty, one that Jack wasn't sure he was ready to face. Lucas, ever the pragmatist, broke the tension. Alright, so we know the land is powerful and we know it could be dangerous, but we're not here to desecrate it. We want to honor it, to build something that will bring respect to our ancestors. Surely that can't be a bad thing. Master Han regarded Lucas for a long moment before nodding slowly. If your intentions are pure, and if you approach the land with respect, it may welcome your shrine. But I warn you, if there is greed, if there is deceit in your hearts when you claim this land, it will know, and the consequences will be dire. Jack swallowed hard, feeling the gravity of Master Han's words settle over him like a heavy cloak. Dire consequences? What could that mean? Death? Madness? Or something worse, something they couldn't even imagine? But Jack couldn't afford to dwell on those fears. They had come too far, invested too much. The land was the key to their family's future, and they couldn't turn back now. Thank you, Master Han, Jack said, his voice steadied despite the turmoil churning inside him. We'll take your advice to heart. We'll approach the land with respect. Master Han studied Jack carefully, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if weighing the sincerity of his words. After a long pause, the old man nodded. Very well. But remember this, the land does not forget, and it does not forgive. With that final, cryptic warning, Master Han rose to his feet, his robes rustling softly as he moved toward the door. The brothers followed him, their minds swirling with thoughts of ancient spirits and untapped power. As they stepped out into the cool night air, the sky above them was clear and starless, as if the universe itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what they would do next. Jack's mind raced as they walked back to their temporary lodging. The plan had always been straightforward: convince Tung to sell the land, build the shrine, and secure their family's future. But now, with Master Han's warnings echoing in his ears, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that this was no longer just a business transaction. There were forces at play that he didn't understand, forces that went beyond money and power. "Do you think he's serious about the curse?" Mark asked, breaking the silence. Jack glanced at his younger brother, noticing the tension in his voice. Mark had always been more attuned to the spiritual side of things. He was the one who had warned them not to push too hard, the one who had sensed something was off about the land from the beginning. "I don't know," Jack admitted. "But we can't let fear stop us. This is our chance to solidify our family's place in history. We can't back down now." Lucas nodded in agreement, though his expression was more guarded than usual. "We need to move quickly. Tung isn't going to sell willingly, but if what Master Han said is true, we have to approach this carefully. We can't just take the land by force." Jack frowned. The idea of forcing Tung's hand had crossed his mind more than once, but now, after hearing about the potential dangers, it didn't seem like such a wise idea. Still, he wasn't ready to give up. "We'll find a way," Jack said firmly. "We have to." As they approached their lodging, the sound of the wind rustling through the trees seemed to grow louder, more insistent, like a distant whisper urging them to reconsider. But Jack pushed the unease aside. He had made up his mind. They would have that land no matter what it took. That night, as Jack lay in bed, he couldn't sleep. His mind replayed the conversation with Master Han over and over again, each word seeping deeper into his consciousness. The energy of the land, the ancient spirits, the warnings about greed and deceit, it all swirled together in a tangled web of fear and ambition. He had always prided himself on being a rational man, someone who didn't believe in ghosts or curses. But now, lying in the dark with only his thoughts for company, Jack couldn't help but wonder if maybe, just maybe, there was more to this world than he had ever imagined. Suddenly a loud thud echoed from outside, breaking the silence. Jack sat up abruptly, his heart pounding in his chest. For a moment he sat frozen, straining to hear any other sounds. Another thud, followed by a faint scraping noise, like something being dragged across the ground. Jack's breath caught in his throat. He slipped out of bed, careful not to make a sound, and crept toward the window. His hand trembled as he pulled back the curtain, just enough to peer outside. In the darkness he could just make out the silhouette of a figure standing at the edge of the property, The figure was hunched over, its movements slow and deliberate, as if it was digging or searching for something. A cold wave of fear washed over Jack as he realized the figure wasn't human. It was a shadow, tall and thin, with no discernible features. Its body seemed to ripple and shift in the moonlight, like smoke caught in the wind. Jack's pulse quickened, and he stepped back from the window, his mind racing. He hadn't imagined it. There was something out there, something that didn't belong. And as the shadow disappeared into the night, Jack knew, deep down, that the land they sought was far more dangerous than they could have ever imagined. Part 3. A dark deal with the Sorcerer. The air in the village had grown thick with an eerie stillness, as though the land itself was holding its breath. Jack felt that stillness deep in his bones, a quiet suffocation that pressed on him day and night. Ever since the confrontation with Mr. Tung and the warning from the Feng Shui master, nothing had been the same. It was as though an invisible hand was pulling them closer to something dark and inevitable. For weeks, Jack had tried everything to convince Tung to sell the land, but the old man remained steadfast, his refusal unwavering. Jack's frustration had turned to anger, and his anger to desperation. The ancestral land was slipping from their grasp, and with it, the future of their family. No amount of money or negotiation could break Tung's iron will. Late one night, as Jack sat alone in his study, a cold wind howling outside, he pored over maps and plans, his mind racing for a solution. His brothers had long since gone to bed, their spirits broken by the endless stalemate. But Jack couldn't give up, he wouldn't. That's when he first heard the name, Tung. It came as a whisper, carried on the wind from the lips of a village elder he had passed earlier that day. The old man had muttered it, eyes wide with fear, when Jack had pressed him about alternative ways to claim the land. At first Jack hadn't paid much attention. But now, as the hours ticked by and the weight of failure pressed down on him, the name echoed in his mind, relentless. Some, a name spoken in whose tomes, a figure shrouded in mystery and power. He was said to be a sorcerer, a man who dealt with forces beyond the natural world, a man who could bend fate to his will for a price. Jack, normally a man of logic and reason, had always scoffed at such things. But now, in the stillness of the night, he felt the grip of desperation tighten around his throat. He needed that land. He needed to secure his family's future. And if some could help him do that, then he was willing to pay whatever price was required. Determined, Jack rose from his desk and grabbed his coat. The village lay silent beneath a full moon, the streets deserted. There was only one place he could go now. The path to Zon's dwelling was not an easy one to find. Hidden deep within the forest, it wound through thick trees and tangled vines, far from the eyes of the village. The deeper Jack ventured into the woods, the more the air seemed to change, growing colder, heavier, almost suffocating. The trees loomed above him like silent sentinels, their twisted branches casting long skeletal shadows across the forest floor. Jack's heart pounded in his chest, but he pressed on, driven by the singular goal that had consumed him. He couldn't turn back now, not when they were so close. At last he arrived at a small, crooked house nestled in a clearing. The house looked ancient, its wooden walls weathered and worn, as though it had stood there for centuries, forgotten by time. A faint light flickered through the cracks in the shutters, casting an eerie glow over the clearing. Jack approached cautiously, his breath visible in the cold night air. He hesitated for a moment, his hand poised to knock on the door. But before he could, the door creaked open on its own, as though it had been expecting him. A voice, low and raspy, drifted from within. Enter Jack swallowed hard and stepped inside. The interior of the house was as strange and unsettling as the man who lived there. Strange symbols adorned the walls, drawn in what looked like blood. Dark objects, animal bones, strange totems, and jars filled with mysterious, writhing substances lined the shelves. The air was thick with the smell of incense and something else, something rotten. Seated at a low table in the center of the room was Zon. The sorcerer was old, impossibly old, his face lined with deep wrinkles that seemed to hold the weight of countless lifetimes. His eyes, however, were sharp and piercing, gleaming with a knowledge that made Jack's skin crawl. Draped in a black robe, Tung exuded an aura of power that was palpable, almost oppressive. So Tung rasped, his voice like the whisper of dead leaves. "You've come to me because you seek something. Beyond your reach," Jack nodded, his mouth dry. "I need your help. I need to take the land. Mr. Tung won't sell, and without it, my family's future is." Tung raised a bony hand, silencing Jack with a gesture. "I know what you seek. The land holds great power, power that could elevate your family to heights you cannot even imagine." His thin lips twisted into a smile that sent a shiver down Jack's spine. But such power does not come without a cost. Jack felt a chill creep through him. What kind of cost? Tung's eyes gleamed as he leaned forward. "The land you seek is bound to ancient forces that do not take kindly to being disturbed. If you wish to claim it, you must perform a ritual, one that will sever the bond between Tung and the land and bind it to you instead. But be warned, once the ritual is performed, there will be no turning back. The forces you unleash will not be easily controlled." Jack hesitated, doubt flickering in his mind. He had come here for answers, for a way to solve his problem. But now, standing in the presence of this dark sorcerer, he wasn't sure he was prepared for the consequences. But then he thought of his brothers, of their future, and of the legacy they were trying to build. He couldn't fail. "Not now. I'm willing to do whatever it takes," Jack said, his voice firm, though his hands trembled slightly. Tung's smile widened, his eyes glinting with satisfaction. "Very well," he said. "But know this, once the ritual begins, the land will be yours. But the forces it contains, they may not serve you as you wish." Jack nodded, pushing down the unease rising in his chest. "What do I have to do?" The ritual was to take place on the night of the new moon, in the heart of the forest, on the land itself. Some provided Jack with everything he needed: strange ingredients, symbols to be drawn on the earth, and a series of incantations that had to be spoken at exactly the right moment. As Jack stood in the clearing that night, the wind howling through the trees, he felt an overwhelming sense of dread settle over him. The air was thick with anticipation, as though the land itself was waiting, watching. He glanced at Tung, who stood a few paces away, his eyes gleaming in the darkness. "Begin," the sorcerer whispered, his voice carried on the wind. Jack knelt and began drawing the symbols in the dirt, his hands shaking as he did so. Each line felt heavier than the last, as though he was carving something irreversible into the very fabric of reality. When the symbols were complete, Jack stood and began the incantation. The words felt foreign in his mouth, unnatural, like they didn't belong to any language he had ever spoken before. The air around him seemed to thicken with each syllable, and the shadows at the edges of the clearing began to shift and writhe. Suddenly the ground beneath him trembled, a low rumble that grew louder and more intense with each passing second. The wind howled louder, and the trees seemed to bend and twist, as though they were being pulled by some invisible force. Jack's heart raced as he continued the incantation, his voice rising to match the growing chaos around him. The symbols on the ground began to glow with an eerie light, casting long, flickering shadows across the clearing. And then, with a deafening roar, the earth split open. A dark, churning void opened beneath the symbols, tendrils of shadow reaching up from the depths like grasping fingers. Jack stumbled backward, his breath caught in his throat as the darkness surged upward, filling the clearing with an oppressive, suffocating presence. The wind died suddenly, leaving a thick, unnatural silence in its wake. Jack stood frozen, his heart hammering in his chest. He had done it. The ritual was complete. But as the darkness coiled around the clearing, Jack felt something else, a presence, cold and malevolent, watching him from within the shadows. It pressed down on him, filling the air with a sense of foreboding that made his skin crawl. He turned to Tung, his voice shaking. What is that?" Zong's smile was thin, his eyes glinting with satisfaction. "That," he said softly, "is the price you have paid. Before Jack could respond, the darkness surged forward, engulfing him in a wave of cold, suffocating terror. Voices, low and guttural, whispered in his ears, their words unintelligible but filled with malice. He tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed by the void. And then, just as suddenly as it had come, the darkness receded, leaving Jack gasping for air in the clearing. Soun stood over him, his expression unreadable. "The land is yours now," he said quietly. "But the forces you awakened, they will not rest." Jack stared up at him, his heart pounding in his chest. He had won. The land was his. But as he looked into the dark, churning void that still lingered at the edges of the clearing, he knew deep down that this victory would come at a cost far greater than he could have ever imagined. The nightmare had only just begun. Part 4. Terror strikes Mr. Tung's family. The stillness of the night was shattered by a bone-chilling scream. It echoed through the quiet village, piercing the silence like a knife. Those who heard it stirred uneasily in their beds, whispering prayers into the darkness. But they all knew the curse had begun. It started innocently enough, with a few strange noises around Mr. Tung's home, the sound of knocking late at night, footsteps where there should be none, and the occasional flicker of lights. The villagers dismissed these occurrences at first. After all, old houses make strange sounds, and Mr. Tung's sawmill, situated at the edge of the village, had always been a place of work, not fear. But something had changed after Jack's visit to the land. The next morning, when Mr. Tung's workers arrived at the sawmill, they found a horrific scene. Two of the night shift workers, seasoned men who had been with Tung for years, were discovered lying lifeless on the sawdust-covered floor. Their bodies were twisted at unnatural angles, their eyes wide open, frozen in terror. Blood stained the wooden planks beneath them, and jagged wounds ran across their limbs, as if they had been caught in the mill saws, yet the machinery hadn't been used. The authorities arrived, but there was no explanation for what had happened. The sawmill's equipment was intact. The security cameras showed nothing, and there were no signs of forced entry. The official report listed the deaths as an industrial accident. But whispers in the village spoke of something far darker, something that couldn't be seen but could definitely be felt. As word spread, fear took root. The villagers began avoiding the sawmill, and rumors swirled that the land itself had turned against Mr. Tung. They spoke of shadows moving in the trees, of whispers carried on the wind. No one dared to say it aloud, but they all knew something was terribly wrong. A dark presence. Inside Mr. Tung's house, things were even worse. Mrs. Tung had always been a robust woman, full of life and energy, the kind of person who kept the family grounded. But soon after the deaths at the mill, her health began to deteriorate at an alarming rate. At first it was subtle. She complained of fatigue, of strange dreams that left her waking in a cold sweat, gasping for breath. But soon it became much more than that. Mrs. Tung's once radiant skin turned pale, almost translucent. Dark circles formed under her eyes, which now seemed perpetually sunken and hollow. Her hands trembled constantly, and her once strong voice grew weak, as if something was draining her vitality. She no longer moved through the house with the same purpose. Instead, she shuffled through the halls, her head constantly turning, as though she sensed something lurking just out of sight. It was the shadows. They were everywhere. At first, only Mrs. Tung seemed to notice them, those dark, fleeting figures that slipped through the corners of the room, disappearing the moment you turned to look. She would call out to her husband, her voice thick with fear, "Tung, there's something in the room. It's watching me." But every time he rushed to her side, there was nothing, just the cold, empty air. And yet, the shadows persisted. They moved with a malevolent grace, flickering in the dim light, always just at the edge of vision. Sometimes, late at night, Mr. Tung himself would feel it too, that cold, crawling sensation down his spine, as though invisible eyes were fixed on him, watching from the darkness. He would lie in bed, staring into the inky blackness, listening to the silence, his heart pounding in his chest, waiting for the next creak, the next whisper, the next flicker of movement. It was driving them both mad. The sawmill's curse. As the haunting grew worse, so did the accidents. Another worker was found dead at the mill just days after the first incident. This time it was a young man barely in his 20s. His body was found crushed beneath a stack of timber, his skull caved in, blood seeping into the sawdust. But what disturbed the authorities most was the look on his face. His eyes were wide open, his mouth twisted into a grotesque scream, frozen in the moment of his death. It was as if he had seen something so horrifying that it had stopped his heart before the timber ever touched him. After that, the workers refused to enter the mill. They spoke of strange noises coming from the machinery at night, the grinding of saws, the clatter of chains, despite the fact that no one had touched the equipment. Some claimed they saw figures lurking in the shadows of the yard, figures that vanished the moment you tried to focus on them. Mr. Tung, desperate to keep his business alive, tried everything. He brought in priests to bless the land, to rid the area of whatever evil had taken root. But it didn't work. In fact, it seemed to make things worse. The shadows grew darker, bolder, creeping closer and closer to the house. Mrs. Tong's decline. As the haunting intensified, Mrs. Tong's condition worsened. She spent most of her days in bed now, her frail body barely able to move. Her breathing was labored, her voice barely a whisper. And yet, even in her weakened state, she was haunted. The shadows didn't care about her illness. They seemed to feed off it. One night, as she lay in bed, drifting between sleep and consciousness, she felt it. The cold breath against her neck. Her eyes snapped open, but she couldn't move. A shadow loomed over her, its shape formless yet oppressive, like a suffocating fog that blotted out the light. She tried to scream, but no sound came. The shadow drew closer, its cold presence pressing down on her chest, stealing the air from her lungs. For what felt like hours, she lay there, paralyzed, as the darkness enveloped her. When the dawn finally broke, and the shadow receded into the corners of the room, she was left gasping for breath, drenched in sweat, her body trembling uncontrollably. "Tung," she whispered, her voice weak. "He's trying to kill me." Mr. Tung sat beside her, his own face pale and gone from lack of sleep. He had tried everything to help her, but nothing worked. He was powerless against the unseen force that tormented them. All he could do was hold her hand and hope that the darkness would pass. But deep down, he knew it wouldn't. The sinister lullaby. Then came the whispers. They started faint, just at the edge of hearing a soft, melodic hum that drifted through the air like a forgotten lullaby. At first it seemed harmless, almost soothing. But as the nights passed, the lullaby grew louder, more insistent, until it filled the entire house with its eerie melody. No matter where they went, they couldn't escape it. The haunting tune followed them from room to room, playing endlessly in the background, a constant reminder that they were never alone. Sometimes, late at night, Mr. Tung would hear it whispering his name, calling him from the darkness. It drove them both to the brink of madness. One night, unable to take it any longer, Mr. Tung stormed through the house, screaming at the top of his lungs, "What do you want?" "Show yourself," but the only response was the soft, mocking hum of the lullaby, drifting through the air like a taunt. Mrs. Tung's final vision. It was a week later when Mrs. Tung had her final, terrifying vision. She had been bedridden for days, too weak to move, her body withering away as the darkness fed on her life force. Mr. Tung was downstairs, pacing the halls, trying to come up with a plan, any plan to save his family. But it was already too late. That night, as the house lay still, Mrs. Tung opened her eyes to find the room bathed in an unnatural light. A figure stood at the foot of her bed, a dark, towering silhouette that radiated malice. Its eyes glowed red in the darkness, and its face was twisted into a grotesque smile. Mrs. Tung tried to scream, but her voice was gone. She could only watch in horror as the figure leaned over her, its cold breath brushing against her skin. Soon it whispered, its voice a low, guttural hiss, "Very soon." And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure was gone, leaving Mrs. Tung trembling in her bed, her heart pounding in her chest. When Mr. Tung found her the next morning, she was barely alive. Her skin was pale as death, her breathing shallow. But her eyes, Her eyes were filled with terror, locked on something only she could see. "It's coming," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "The darkness is coming." The final descent. As the days passed, the Tung household became a place of unrelenting terror. The shadows grew bolder, the whispers louder. The house itself seemed to groan under the weight of the curse, the walls creaking and shifting as though the very foundation was being pulled apart by unseen hands. No one in the village dared to visit. The Tung family was alone, isolated, trapped in their haunted home with no escape. And then, one night, the lights in the house flickered and went out, plunging the entire property into darkness. A thick, oppressive silence followed, broken only by the sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate footsteps echoing through the halls. Part 5. Jack's realization of the curse. The night was suffocating. The air hung thick and still, with an oppressive weight that seemed to press down on everything around it. Jack lay awake in his bed, his heart pounding in his chest as he replayed the events of the last few days. He could hear the wind howling outside his window, but it wasn't a natural wind. It felt alive, like it was carrying something dark and malevolent, something he had unleashed. It had been days since the ritual, but the consequences were becoming clear with every passing hour. The first death at the sawmill had shaken him, but he convinced himself it was an accident, just bad luck. But when the second death occurred, followed by the workers' refusal to return, the reality began to sink in. He couldn't escape it. This was no coincidence. Jack sat up, his body drenched in sweat. The room was unnaturally cold, and yet a fire seemed to burn inside him, a gnawing guilt that he couldn't ignore any longer. He had brought this upon Mr. Tong's family. This was his fault. But it wasn't supposed to be like this. The memory of that night in the forest flashed in his mind. Zone's voice, low and rasping, had echoed in his ears as the ground split open beneath them. Jack had felt the power rising from the earth, dark and wild, as if the very land had been waiting for its release. At the time, he had thought he could control it, use it to his advantage. He'd been blinded by ambition, by the promise of power. He hadn't understood what he was dealing with. The old sorcerer's warning seemed distant now, like a faded echo in the recesses of his mind. "The forces you awaken will not be easily controlled." Jack had brushed off the words then, confident that he could handle whatever dark magic was involved. After all, he wasn't a fool. He wasn't some superstitious villager who believed in ghosts and curses. But now, as he watched the shadows twist and writhe around him, as he heard whispers in the dead of night that chilled him to the bone, he realized how terribly wrong he had been. Zone hadn't lied. The curse had taken on a life of its own, spreading like a disease, infecting everything it touched. It wasn't just the land anymore. It was reaching into the very souls of the people around it, twisting their lives into something dark and grotesque. Jack had called upon forces far older and far more dangerous than he could have ever imagined. He had damned them all. The signs of decay. The signs were all there, now that Jack allowed himself to see them. Mr. Tong's family was falling apart. Jack had overheard whispers from the villagers, whispers of what was happening inside the Tong household, how Mrs. Tong had taken ill, how her strength was being sapped by something unseen, something malevolent. They said that shadows moved in her room at night, that she spoke of figures standing over her bed, watching her while she slept, their breath cold on her skin. Jack had even heard rumors that Mr. Tung himself had seen these things, dark figures that lingered in the corners of his home, slipping in and out of sight like nightmares brought to life. It was no longer just paranoia. The darkness was real, and it was growing stronger every day. Jack's hands trembled as he poured himself a drink, the amber liquid splashing over the edge of the glass. His mind was spinning, trying to comprehend what he had unleashed. He had wanted the land so badly, wanted it for his family, for their future. But now the thought of that cursed earth filled him with dread. It wasn't just about owning the land anymore, it was about survival. The curse was feeding off the very essence of the Tong family, and if it continued, there would be nothing left of them. But What terrified Jack even more was the realization that the curse was no longer just targeting Tom, it was spreading. He had seen the signs, the way the shadows in his own home seemed to cling to the walls, the way he heard whispers in the dead of night, just out of reach, like a chorus of unseen voices calling his name. The curse was alive, and it wanted more. It wanted him. The haunting of Jack's mind. The first time Jack truly understood that the curse had crossed over into his life was when he began seeing the figure in the mirror. It was a fleeting thing at first, a trick of the light. He would glance at his reflection and catch a shadowy movement behind him, something dark and shapeless that would disappear the moment he turned around. He told himself it was stress, that his mind was playing tricks on him. But then it became more frequent. One night, as he stood in front of the bathroom mirror, splashing cold water on his face, he saw it again, only this time it didn't vanish when he looked. The figure stood behind him, tall and thin, its features obscured by darkness. Jack froze, his heart pounding in his chest as the figure moved closer, its hand reaching toward him. He spun around, but there was nothing there. The room was empty. Jack stared at the empty space where the figure had been, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He felt the cold presence lingering, as though the shadow was still there, watching him from just beyond the veil of reality. He backed away slowly, his legs trembling. It had followed him. The curse had followed him home. The days that followed were filled with unease. Every corner of his house felt darker. Every shadow seemed to stretch just a little too far. He began hearing things, soft whispers, carried on the wind, indistinct voices that seemed to be calling his name. And always, there was the figure in the mirror, watching him with those empty, hollow eyes. A desperate search for answers. Desperation clawed at Jack's insides. He had to stop this, he had to undo what had been done, before it was too late. But where could he turn? Zun had disappeared the night after the ritual, fading into the shadows as if he had never existed. Jack had tried to find him, to seek his help in reversing the curse, but Zun was a ghost, slipping through his fingers like sand. With nowhere else to go, Jack turned to the villagers, hoping that anyone could provide an answer. He sought out the elders, those who still remembered the old ways, the old stories. But they only looked at him with fear in their eyes, crossing themselves and muttering prayers under their breath. "You've angered the spirits," one old man had said, his voice trembling. "There's no going back now. The land has claimed its due." Jack refused to believe it. There had to be a way to stop this. There had to be. But the more he searched, the clearer it became he was trapped. The curse was ancient, tied to the very fabric of the land, and it couldn't be undone, not by him, not by anyone. The shadows deepened. As the days wore on, the darkness around Jack grew more palpable. His home became a prison, each room filled with a suffocating sense of dread. The figure in the mirror became bolder, lingering longer, its presence more oppressive. It no longer waited for him to turn away now. It stood behind him, always just out of reach, its breath cold on the back of his neck. The shadows in his house seemed to come alive, shifting and writhing like living things. At night, when the house was still, he could hear them, whispers carried on the wind, voices that weren't there, calling his name over and over again. "Jack, Jack." The sound sent shivers down his spine. It wasn't just the voices, it was the way they said his name with a mocking, malevolent tone, as though they were laughing at him, reveling in his fear. The darkness was toying with him, playing games, pushing him closer and closer to the edge. His brothers began to notice the change in him. Lucas confronted him one evening, his face lined with concern. "Jack, what's going on? You look like you haven't slept in days. You're pale as a ghost." Jack tried to brush it off, but the strain was showing. The guilt, the fear, the relentless presence of the curse, it was wearing him down, eating away at him piece by piece. "I'm fine," Jack lied, his voice hollow. "It's just stress," but Lucas wasn't convinced. He pressed further. "Is this about Tung? What happened at the mill?" Jack's heart raced. He couldn't tell Lucas the truth. Not yet. His brother wouldn't understand, none of them would. They didn't know what Jack had done, what he had unleashed. They didn't feel the darkness crawling under their skin, whispering in their ears. No, Jack said finally, his voice barely a whisper. It's not about the mill. The final realization. It wasn't until the nightmare started that Jack truly understood how deep the curse had rooted itself in his life. Every night he would wake in a cold sweat, his sheets tangled around him, his heart pounding in his chest. The dreams were always the same. He was standing in the middle of the clearing where the ritual had taken place, surrounded by shadows. The earth beneath him would tremble, split open, and from the darkness, the figure would rise, reaching for him with long, twisted fingers. Jacket would whisper, its voice a low, guttural growl, "You cannot escape." He would try to run, but the ground would open up beneath him, swallowing him whole, pulling him into the darkness. He would wake just as the shadows consumed him, gasping for breath, his body trembling with fear. The curse had infected his mind, his soul. There was no escaping it. One night, after yet another nightmare, Jack sat on the edge of his bed, his head in his hands. He couldn't keep living like this. The curse was tearing him apart, slowly, piece by piece, and yet he knew there was nothing he could do. The curse had taken on a life of its own, and now it was feeding on him. He had unleashed something far darker than he could have ever imagined, and now it was coming for him. Part 6. The Shaman's Revelation. The air in Mr. Tung's house was thick with fear, an oppressive weight that pressed down on everything and everyone inside. The once lively home now felt like a tomb, each room filled with an eerie silence that made the hair on the back of Mr. Tung's neck stand on end. He hadn't slept in days, not properly. How could he, when every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind seemed to carry with it the threat of something far worse lurking in the shadows? His wife, May, was a ghost of her former self. She lay in their bed, frail and pale, her eyes wide with terror, even when they were closed. The doctors had come and gone, shaking their heads, muttering words about stress and exhaustion, but Mr. Tung knew better. It wasn't some illness that was draining the life from his wife, it was something darker, something far beyond what the doctors could comprehend. The sawmill had become a place of death. First, his workers had fallen, their bodies broken in ways that defied explanation, and now his home was no longer his own. The shadows moved when they shouldn't, and the darkness whispered things that made his skin crawl. He couldn't ignore it anymore. The land, the very earth on which his house and mill stood, had turned against him. But why? Tung sat alone in his study, staring at the flickering candlelight, his hands trembling. He had heard the whispers in the village. People were saying the land was cursed, that something had been unleashed, something ancient and malevolent. The elders had warned him about this land years ago, when his family first settled here, but he had ignored their superstitions. Now though, he could no longer afford the luxury of disbelief. There was only one person who could help him now, the village shaman. A desperate journey. The path to the shaman's hut was narrow and winding, cutting through the dense forest that bordered the village. Tung had made this journey only once before, many years ago when his daughter had fallen ill as a child. The shaman had healed her then with strange herbs and whispered incantations. Tung had never believed in such things, but his desperation had led him back to the shaman's doorstep. The forest seemed different this time, darker, more hostile. The trees loomed overhead like silent sentinels, their branches twisting into grotesque shapes that clawed at the sky. The wind howled through the branches, but it carried no comfort, only the eerie sound of something watching him, something that lurked just beyond the reach of the flickering lantern in his hand. Tung pressed forward, his heart racing with each step. He could feel the eyes on him, though he couldn't see them. The shadows around him felt alive, as though they were waiting, watching for the right moment to strike. He pulled his coat tighter around him, trying to keep out the unnatural cold that seeped into his bones. Finally, after what felt like hours, Tung arrived at the shaman's hut. It was a small, ramshackle structure, hidden deep within the forest, surrounded by strange totems and charms that hung from the trees like guardians of the unknown. The smell of incense wafted from inside, thick and pungent, mingling with the damp earth. With a trembling hand, Tung knocked on the door. For a moment there was silence, and Tung's heart sank, wondering if he had come all this way for nothing. But then, slowly, the door creaked open, revealing the shaman. He was an old man, older than Tung remembered, his skin wrinkled and leathery, his eyes clouded with age yet still sharp with the knowledge that went beyond the natural world. "You've come," the shaman said, his voice raspy, as though he had been expecting Tung all along. Tung nodded, his voice hoarse with fear. "I need your help." The shaman stepped aside, motioning for Tung to enter. The inside of the hut was dimly lit by candles, their flickering flames casting long, dancing shadows across the walls. Strange herbs and dried plants hummed from the ceiling, and the air was thick with the smell of smoke and earth. In the center of the room was a low table, covered with strange trinkets, bones and symbols that Tung couldn't understand. The shaman gestured for Tung to sit, and once they were both seated, he spoke again. "The land is sick," the shaman said, his eyes locking onto Tung's with an intensity that made Tung's stomach churn. "Something has been awakened. An evil force that was never meant to be." Disturbed, Tung swallowed hard, the words sending a chill down his spine. "What kind of force? What has been unleashed?" The shaman's gaze darkened, his wrinkled hands moving over the bones on the table, as though reading their message. "A curse," he whispered. "A curse bound to the land, tied to its very soil. It is older than any of us, and it is hungry. This curse was never meant to be used for personal gain, but someone has summoned it, forced it to rise, and now it seeks to destroy." Tung's heart sank. He had feared something like this, but hearing it spoken aloud made it all too real. "But why? Why is it attacking my family?" The shaman leaned forward, his voice dropping to a low, ominous whisper. "The curse was meant to claim the land. It cannot rest until it has consumed what it was awakened for. Your family stands in its way." Tung's mind raced, his thoughts swirling in a maelstrom of terror and confusion. But who would do this? Who would summon such a thing? For a moment, the shaman was silent, his gaze never leaving Tung's. And then slowly he spoke the words that made Tung's blood run cold. "It was not the land that called this curse. It was someone else, someone who desires what you have." Tung's breath caught in his throat as the truth began to dawn on him. The pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. Jack's desperation to buy the land, the strange occurrences that had started after Jack's last visit, the dark force that now tormented his family. "Jack," Tung whispered, his voice shaking. It was Jack. The shaman nodded solemnly. He saw the land, but he didn't know the price. He has unleashed a force that cannot be controlled, and now it seeks to devour everything in its path. Tung felt the world around him tilt, his vision swimming as the weight of the revelation crushed him. Jack had done this. Jack had brought this nightmare upon his family. The man who had once been his friend, his neighbor, had betrayed him in the most horrific way possible. Confronting the horror, Tung staggered to his feet, his mind reeling. He had to confront Jack. He had to stop this madness before it was too late. But even as he thought it, he knew deep down that there was no stopping it. The curse had already been unleashed. It had taken root in the land, and now it was spreading, growing stronger with each passing day. "Is there anything I can do?" Tung asked, his voice desperate, his hands shaking. "Is there any way to stop this?" The shaman's expression was grim, his eyes filled with a sadness that told Tung everything he needed to know. "Once the curse has been awakened, it cannot be easily put to rest. The land has been claimed, and it will continue to feed until it has taken everything." Tung's heart pounded in his chest, the weight of hopelessness crushing him. "But my family," the shaman held up a hand, his voice soft but firm. "There may be one way, but it is dangerous. The curse is bound to the one who summoned it. If you can sever that bond, if you can confront the one who called it forth and force him to undo what he has done, you might be able to weaken the curse's hold on the land." Tung's stomach twisted with dread. He knew what the shaman was saying. He would have to confront Jack. He would have to force him to reverse the ritual, to face the consequences of his actions. But could it even be undone? And even if he could, would Jack agree? There was no time to think. Tung had to try, for his wife, for his family. The confrontation. The walk back to the village was a blur. Tung's mind was racing, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and rage. He had never been a man of violence, but the thought of what Jack had done, of how he had condemned Tung's family to this horror, filled him with a fury that he could barely contain. By the time he reached Jack's house, the sun was beginning to set, casting long, ominous shadows over the village. Tung stood outside the door, his fists clenched, his breath coming in shallow gasps. For a moment he hesitated. What if the shaman was wrong? What if this was all just some terrible misunderstanding? But then he thought of May, of the way her body trembled with fear of the shadows that haunted their home. No, this wasn't a misunderstanding. Jack had done this. With a deep breath, Tung raised his fist and pounded on the door. It swung open almost immediately, revealing Jack standing in the doorway, his face pale, his eyes wide with something that looked like guilt or perhaps fear. For a moment the two men stared at each other, the air between them thick with tension. Tung, Jack said, his voice barely a whisper. Tung didn't give him a chance to say more. What have you done? He demanded, his voice shaking with rage. What did you do to my family? Jack took a step back, his face draining of color. I didn't mean for this to happen. The words sent a jolt of anger through Tung's body, his hands trembling with barely contained fury. You summoned a curse. You brought this nightmare upon us. Jack's face twisted with guilt, his eyes filling with tears. I didn't know it would go this far. I just wanted the land. I thought you thought. Tung's voice was a growl now, his fists clenched at his sides. You thought you could take my land and destroy my family. Jack shook his head, his voice desperate. It was a mistake. I didn't know what I was doing, but Tung wasn't listening anymore. The rage that had been building inside him finally exploded, and he lunged at Jack, grabbing him by the collar and shoving him against the wall. Undo it, Tung shouted, his voice hoarse with anger. You have to undo it. Jack's eyes widened with fear, his breath coming in ragged gasps. I don't know if I can. You have to try, Tung growled, his voice filled with desperation. But even as the words left his mouth, Tung knew it was too late. The curse had already claimed them, and there was no turning back. The darkness was growing, feeding off their fear, and soon it would consume them all. And there was nothing any of them could do to stop it. Part 7. Jack's Plea for help. The night was suffocatingly still as Jack stumbled through the darkened streets of the village, his heart hammering in his chest. Every shadow seemed alive, curling and stretching toward him like the fingers of some unseen predator, and his breath came in shallow, panicked gasps. He had lost control? No, he had never had control. The curse had taken on a life of its own, and now it was devouring everything in its path. Mr. Tung's family was crumbling, his wife was on the brink of death, and the sawmill had become a cursed ground that no one dared approach. And Jack, he was at the center of it all, trapped in a nightmare of his own making. The name echoed in his mind like a bitter taste on his tongue. The sorcerer was the only one who could help him now. Jack had to believe that. He needed to believe it, or else there was nothing left but madness. He had to find Zun again, had to beg him to undo the curse, to stop the growing darkness that had already taken so much. It wasn't supposed to be like this. It wasn't supposed to spiral out of control. The path to Zun's lair was a familiar one now, but the forest seemed different this time, more menacing. The trees loomed higher, their branches twisting into grotesque shapes that clawed at the sky. The wind howled through the undergrowth, but it carried no comfort, only a whisper of doom that gnawed at Jack's already frayed nerves. He pressed on, driven by desperation and guilt, his mind spinning with the memory of Tung's pale, grief-stricken face and May's whispered pleas for help. What had he done? As Jack neared the clearing where Zun's hut stood, he could see the faint glow of candlelight through the twisted trees. The sight filled him with equal parts dread and hope. This was his last chance. If Zun couldn't stop the curse, then there was no stopping it at all. Jack's hands trembled as he approached the door. and he hesitated for a moment, his mind racing with the thought that perhaps Tung had left, vanished into the night as mysteriously as he had come. But the door creaked open before Jack could knock, as if the sorcerer had been expecting him. "Come in," Zun's voice rasped from the shadows, low and cold like the wind before a storm. Jack stepped inside, his heart pounding in his throat. The air was thick with the smell of incense and decay, and strange, unidentifiable objects hung from the walls, dried herbs, bones, and things that looked like they had once been alive. The dim light flickered over Zun's ancient face, casting deep shadows in the hollows of his eyes and making his features look even more sunken, more skeletal. The sorcerer sat cross-legged at the center of the room, surrounded by his strange trinkets and symbols etched into the dirt floor. His sharp, dark eyes fixed on Jack as if he were peering into his very soul. "You've returned," Zun said, his voice devoid of any surprise. There was no warmth, no hint of sympathy, just cold, detached observation. "I told you there would be consequences." Jack's throat tightened, his stomach churning with a mix of fear and guilt. He fell to his knees before Zun, the weight of his actions pressing down on him until he could barely breathe. "Please," Jack gasped, his voice shaking. "Please, you have to help me. The curse is out of control. People are dying. Tung's family, they're being torn apart. I didn't know it would be like this." I didn't understand. Zun's expression didn't change. He watched Jack with the same unflinching gaze, his eyes gleaming like polished stones in the flickering candlelight. "You knew enough," he said softly, his voice laced with an eerie calm. "I warned you. The forces you summoned are not to be trifled with. They are ancient, hungry, and once unleashed they cannot be controlled." Jack shook his head, tears welling up in his eyes. "But there must be a way to stop it. There must be something you can do. You're the one who set this in motion. Please, help me undo it." Zun's lips twisted into a cold smile, one that sent a shiver down Jack's spine. "You misunderstand, Jack. I didn't set anything in motion. You did. The moment you agreed to the ritual, you opened the door. I merely pointed the way." Jack's heart sank, and a cold sweat broke out across his skin. "I didn't know what I was doing," he whispered, his voice barely audible. I thought it was just a ritual. I didn't think it would lead to this." Zun's smile faded, replaced by a look of grim finality. "You sought power, Jack. You wanted to claim the land for yourself, to take it from Tung and secure your family's legacy. But you failed to understand that power, true power, comes with a price. The spirits you called upon are not tools to be used. They are living forces, and they demand their due." Jack's hands clenched into fists, his nails digging into his palms. He had been so blind, so consumed by greed and ambition, that he hadn't stopped to consider the consequences. And now, the curse had spiraled out of control, and he was powerless to stop it. "Then what can I do?" Jack demanded, his voice rising with desperation. "There must be something. Tell me how to end it." Zun's eyes narrowed, and for the first time, Jack saw something flicker in the sorcerer's gaze, something dark, something almost amused. "End it," he repeated, his voice dripping with disdain. "You cannot end it, Jack. The curse has already taken root in the land. It has bound itself to the soil, to the bones of the earth. You've unleashed it, and now it will feed until it has taken what it wants." Jack recoiled, horror twisting in his gut. "What does it want?" Zun's eyes gleamed, his smile returning colder than before. "It wants blood. It wants the land to be cleansed. It will not rest until everything that stands in its way has been destroyed." The words hit Jack like a physical blow, and for a moment the room seemed to spin around him. His mind raced, searching for some glimmer of hope, some way to reverse the damage he had caused. But Zun's words rang in his ears, cruel and unyielding. "You're lying," Jack said, though his voice trembled with uncertainty. "There has to be a way." Zun's expression darkened, and the light in the room seemed to dim even further. "There is no lie, Jack. You sought to bend the spirits to your will, but they are not so easily commanded. They have tasted the blood of Tung's family, and now they will not stop until they've had their fill. There is no undoing what you set in motion." Jack staggered to his feet, panic clawing at his chest. The weight of the curse pressed down on him, a suffocating presence that filled the room. He had come here for salvation, for some kind of redemption, but all he had found was the cold, brutal truth there was no way out. He had damned them all. But you can control them, Jack insisted, his voice rising with desperation. You're the one who knows how to work this magic. There has to be something you can do, some spell, some ritual knows uninterrupted, his voice as sharp as a blade. The spirits are beyond my control now. They have been awakened, and they are bound to the land. Even I cannot interfere with what has been set free. The only thing you can do is wait, and watch as they claim their due. Jack's knees buckled, and he sank back to the floor, his heart pounding in his chest. Wait, watch? Was that all that was left for him? To sit idly by while the curse consumed Tung's family, while it devoured everything in its path. Then what was the point, Jack muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. What was the point of all of this? Zoom's gaze softened, almost imperceptibly, but there was no warmth in his eyes, only cold understanding. The point, he said quietly, was power. You wanted it, and now you must live with the consequences of that desire. Power always comes at a cost, Jack. You knew this, even if you chose to ignore it. Jack's vision blurred with tears, the enormity of his failure crushing him. He had thought he could control it, thought he could take what he wanted without paying the price. But now, the curse had spiraled beyond his grasp, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The horror he had unleashed was feeding on the land, on the people he had once called friends, and it was all his fault. Is there really nothing I can do? Jack whispered, his voice broken, his spirit shattered. Soon stood slowly, his movements deliberate, as if weighed down by centuries of knowledge. He looked down at Jack with something that might have been pity, but his words were cold and final. You are trapped in this, Jack. There is no escape. The curse will run its course, and you will be forced to witness the destruction you helped bring forth. Jack stared at the floor, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He had hoped for redemption, for some way to atone for what he had done, but there was no redemption, no atonement, only darkness. Song turned away, his robes rustling softly in the still air. Leave, he said, his voice as empty as the void. There is nothing more for you here. Jack stood, his legs weak, his heart heavy with despair. The weight of the curse pressed down on him, its tendrils curling around his soul, pulling him deeper into the abyss. There was no hope, no way to undo what had been done. As he stumbled out of the hut and into the cold, unforgiving night, Jack knew with a sickening certainty that he was truly and utterly lost. The curse had claimed him, and now there was nothing left but to wait for the end.
Part 8. The curse turns on Jack. The cold night air clung to Jack like a suffocating shroud as he staggered back home, his mind reeling from the crushing weight of Zun's words. The sorcerer's final declaration still echoed in his head, relentlessly gnawing at the edges of his sanity. There is no escape. It was true, there was no stopping the curse. It was alive now, growing stronger with each passing day, feeding off the misery and fear it had unleashed. And worse, it was no longer confined to Mr. Tung's family. It was coming for his. The moment Jack crossed the threshold of his home, he knew something was terribly wrong. The house was unnaturally still, the air thick with an oppressive silence that made his skin crawl. The usual warmth of the fire that his brothers kept lit had long since died out, leaving the interior bathed in shadows. His breath caught in his throat as he called out, "Lucas." Matthew, but there was no reply. Only the weighty stillness that wrapped around him like a noose tightening with every step he took. He found his brother Lucas in the living room, staring into the darkness. His face, normally filled with vitality, was pale and drained, his eyes hollow and sunken, as though he hadn't slept in days. He didn't even flinch when Jack entered the room. It was as if Lucas didn't see him at all, his gaze fixed on something far beyond the physical world. Jack's stomach twisted with dread. Jack's voice was barely more than a whisper, but the sound seemed to break the oppressive silence, if only for a moment. Lucas finally turned his head, his movements slow and mechanical, like a puppet on strings. His eyes, once full of life, were now empty, as though something had reached inside and hollowed him out. "It's happening, Jack," he muttered, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "It's here. And it's coming for us." Jack's blood ran cold. "What are you talking about? What's coming?" Lucas's lips trembled, and he leaned forward, lowering his voice as if afraid of being overheard. "I've been seeing things. Shadows. Things moving in the dark. It's not just the land, Jack. It's not just Tung's family, it's us. The curse. It's turned on us." Jack stumbled back, his heart pounding in his chest. He had feared this, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real. His hands shook as he tried to process what Lucas was saying. "No," he whispered, almost to himself. "It can't be. I didn't mean for this to happen." It was supposed to. Lucas cut him off with a harsh laugh, his voice tinged with hysteria. "It doesn't matter what you meant. You brought this on us. You invited this evil into our lives, and now it's claiming what it wants." Before Jack could respond, the lights in the house flickered. Once, twice, and then they went out completely, plunging the room into darkness. The silence that followed was suffocating. The shadows seemed to swell, growing thicker, denser, like a living presence creeping through the house. Jack's breath quickened, and he felt the cold, malevolent energy pressing down on him from all sides. Lucas Jack reached out in the dark, but his brother was no longer there. Panic surged through Jack's veins. He fumbled for the matches in his pocket, his hands shaking so badly he could barely light one. The tiny flame flickered to life, casting faint, dancing shadows across the room. But Lucas was gone, vanished, as though the darkness had swallowed him whole. "No, no, no," Jack muttered under his breath, the panic rising to a fever pitch. His mind raced as he stumbled through the house, searching frantically for his brothers. Lucas, Matthew, but the house was empty, or at least it seemed to be. As Jack moved from room to room, it felt as though the walls were closing in on him. The darkness was alive, and it was watching him. Then came the whispers. At first, they were barely audible, like a distant echo carried on the wind. But as Jack made his way down the hallway, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They were everywhere, swirling around him, filling the air with unintelligible murmurs that sent chills down his spine. Jack. His name. The voices were calling his name now, their tone mocking, laced with malice. Jack froze, his blood turning to ice. He spun around, holding the flickering match in front of him, but there was nothing there, only the oppressive darkness that stretched on endlessly. The whispers continued, growing louder and more frenzied, filling his ears until it felt like his head would explode. Jack. Suddenly the shadows seemed to ripple, like black water disturbed by an unseen force. Shapes began to form, twisted, distorted figures that emerged from the darkness, their eyes glowing with a faint, malevolent light. Jack stumbled back, his heart hammering in his chest as the figures moved closer, their forms becoming more distinct with each passing second. And then, as if pulled by some invisible thread, they vanished, leaving only silence in their wake. Jack stood there, panting, his skin clammy with sweat. The house was silent again, but the shadows still pressed in on him, suffocating in their intensity. He had to find his brothers. He had to get them out of here before it was too late. But when Jack reached the back of the house, the room he shared with his youngest brother, Matthew, was empty. The bed was unmade, the sheets crumpled as though someone had just been lying there. But Matthew was gone. Jack's heart sank. He was losing them. One by one, they were being claimed by the curse. He felt the darkness closing in, tightening its grip on everything around him. The house, the land, it was no longer his. It had become the curse's domain, a twisted reflection of the prosperity they had once sought. And now it was consuming them, piece by piece. The first loss, the first to disappear, was Lucas. After that night in the living room, Jack never saw him again. It was as if he had been swallowed by the shadows, erased from existence. There was no sign of a struggle, no trace of where he had gone. Just nothing. One moment he was there. The next he was gone. Jack searched the village, asked the neighbors, even combed the nearby woods, but it was all in vain. Lucas was gone, and deep down, Jack knew that the curse had claimed him. It wasn't just targeting Tung's family anymore. The curse was spreading, and now it had turned its malevolent gaze on Jack and his brothers. The very land they had fought for, the land they had believed would bring them prosperity, was now the source of their destruction. It wasn't long before Matthew vanished too. One evening, Jack returned to the house after yet another futile search for Lucas, only to find Matthew's room in disarray. His belongings were scattered across the floor, the bed sheets twisted and torn, as if he had been dragged from his bed in the middle of the night. But there were no footprints, no signs of forced entry. Just the same eerie, suffocating silence that had swallowed Lucas whole. Jack was alone now. The descent into madness. The days that followed were a blur of fear and madness. Jack rarely slept, his mind unraveling with each passing moment. The house had become a prison, a living, breathing entity that seemed to pulse with the dark energy of the curse. The whispers followed him everywhere, growing louder, more insistent, filling his head with thoughts that weren't his own. The shadows moved constantly now, always just at the edge of his vision, twisting and contorting into grotesque shapes that mocked him in the flickering candlelight. At night he would lie awake in his bed, his eyes wide and bloodshot, listening to the sound of footsteps in the hallways, footsteps that didn't belong to anyone. Footsteps that seemed to grow closer and closer with each passing night. He tried to leave the house once, tried to flee the cursed land, but something held him back. Every time he stepped out the front door, a cold, invisible force pushed him back inside, as though the land itself refused to let him go. He was trapped, bound to the curse like a puppet on strings. The final straw came one night when Jack awoke to find himself not in his bed, but standing in the middle of the clearing where the ritual had taken place. The moon hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the twisted trees that surrounded him. The ground beneath his feet was cold and hard, and the air was thick with the stench of decay. The whispers returned, louder than ever, filling the night air with their sinister chorus. Jack. Jack. He turned in circles, his heart pounding in his chest as the shadows gathered around him, their twisted forms moving closer, closer. The figures that had haunted him for so long finally took shape, their eyes glowing with a cold, unnatural light. They were no longer just shadows. They were spirits twisted, vengeful spirits that had been unleashed by the curse, and they were coming for him. Jack tried to run, but his feet felt heavy, as though they were rooted to the ground. The spirits moved with terrifying speed, surrounding him, their faces twisted into grotesque smiles. He felt their cold breath on his skin, their skeletal fingers brushing against his face. And then, one by one, they began to vanish, fading into the night, leaving Jack standing alone in the clearing. But he knew they were still there, watching, waiting. The curse wasn't finished with him yet. It had taken Lucas, it had taken Matthew, and now it was coming for him. The land, once a symbol of their future prosperity, had become a place of death and decay. And Jack, trapped in the nightmare of his own making, had no choice but to face the darkness alone. The curse had claimed its due.
Part 9. The final descent into darkness. The night was dense, thick with the weight of shadows that seemed to breathe and shift in the corners of Jack's vision. The oppressive darkness had become a constant companion, a suffocating presence that clung to him day and night, whispering in his ear, mocking him with every step he took. His brothers were gone, consumed by the curse he had unleashed, and now he was all that remained. He sat in the center of the house, the once proud home that had been his family's refuge. Now it was little more than a decaying shell, much like Jack himself. The walls were streaked with grime, the windows covered in dust so thick no light could penetrate. The air was cold, stagnant, as though the house had long since been abandoned by the living. And in many ways it had. The land outside, the coveted land that Jack and his brothers had fought so hard to secure, lay untouched. It stretched out before him like a graveyard, barren and forsaken. The trees stood silent and twisted, their branches gnarled and blackened, as if the very soil had rotted beneath them. The river, once a shimmering line of life, now slithered through the landscape like a dark, serpentine scar. Nothing moved, nothing lived. It was as though the land had died the moment the curse was set in motion, a cursed monument to the greed and desperation that had led Jack and his family to their destruction. The shrine, the ancestral shrine that was meant to be their legacy, would never be built. The foundations of Jack's grand vision lay buried beneath the cursed earth, forgotten, swallowed by the very forces he had called upon to claim it. His family's legacy had been reduced to dust, and the future Jack had fought so desperately to secure was now nothing more than a fading memory, the lonely hours. The days had ceased to have meaning. Time itself had become fluid, indistinguishable from the nightmares that plagued Jack's every waking moment. He could no longer tell when he was awake and when he was trapped in the twisted realm of his own mind. Every sound, every shadow seemed to pulse with life, as though the darkness itself had eyes and ears, always watching, always waiting. The whispers were relentless now, a chorus of malevolent voices that echoed in every corner of the house. They called his name over and over, never ceasing, never letting him rest. Jack. Jack. At first he had fought against them, screaming into the void, begging for silence. But the spirits did not listen. They were not interested in his pleas or his sorrow. They had been summoned, and now they were here to stay. The curse had woven itself into the very fabric of the land, of the house, of Jack himself. There was no escape. The spirits haunted him, their ghostly forms flickering at the edges of his vision. Sometimes, in the dead of night, he would see them more clearly, twisted figures standing in the doorway, their hollow eyes glowing with an unnatural light. They never spoke, but their presence was enough to send shivers down Jack's spine, filling him with a terror he could never outrun. And then, there were the shadows. They moved with a life of their own now, crawling up the walls, seeping across the floor like black, viscous oil. Jack would sit for hours, watching them, unable to tear his eyes away as they shifted and writhed, twisting into grotesque shapes that resembled the faces of his lost brothers. He was alone in the house, completely and utterly alone. And yet, he was never truly alone. A crumbling mind. Jack's mind had begun to unravel, frayed at the edges by the constant onslaught of fear, guilt, and isolation. He no longer knew how long it had been since his brothers disappeared, since the curse had taken root. Days, weeks, months, it was all the same now. Time had lost its meaning. His body, too, had begun to wither. His once strong frame had grown gaunt, his skin pale and stretched tight over his bones. Dark circles ringed his eyes, the result of countless sleepless nights spent staring into the dark, waiting for the inevitable arrival of the spirits that haunted him. His hands shook constantly, and his breath came in shallow, uneven gasps, as though even the act of breathing had become a struggle. Every corner of the house felt haunted, every room steeped in the malevolent energy of the curse. The air itself seemed to hum with the presence of the spirits, and Jack could feel their eyes on him, even when he couldn't see them. He had stopped trying to escape the thought of leaving the house, of stepping outside into the cursed land, filled him with a dread so deep it paralyzed him. There was nowhere to go, nowhere to run. The curse was his, bound to him as tightly as the air in his lungs. He was the architect of his own destruction, and there was no way to undo what had been done. The shadows claimed him. It was on a night much like any other, cold, silent, and suffocating, that the final descent into darkness began. Jack had taken to sitting in the center of the house, surrounded by the decaying remnants of what had once been his family's home. The fire in the hearth had long since gone cold, leaving the room bathed in shadow. The only light came from the flickering candle he held in his trembling hand, its weak flame casting faint, dancing shadows on the walls. The whispers had been growing louder all evening, a constant hum that buzzed at the back of Jack's mind. He tried to block them out, but they were impossible to ignore. They filled the room, filled his head, until it felt like they were pushing him to the brink of madness. Jack. 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 The voices called to him, soft and insistent, as though they were trying to draw him deeper into the darkness. He clenched his fists, his knuckles white, his jaw tight with fear and frustration. He couldn't take it anymore. He couldn't live like this, trapped, haunted, a prisoner in his own home. But just as the thought crossed his mind, the shadows in the room began to move. At first it was subtle, barely noticeable, a slight flicker, a small ripple in the darkness. But then, slowly, the shadows began to shift, crawling across the floor like living things, pulling together in the center of the room. Jack watched, frozen with terror, as the shadows twisted and writhed, taking shape, forming into something human. No, not human. The figure that emerged from the shadows was tall and thin, its body impossibly long and distorted, as though it had been stretched beyond the limits of nature. Its skin was black as night, blending seamlessly with the darkness around it, and its eyes glowed with an unnatural, fiery light, burning into Jack with a malevolent intensity that made his heart stop. The candle slipped from Jack's trembling hand and fell to the floor, extinguishing in a small puff of smoke. The room was plunged into total darkness, save for the glowing eyes of the creature that now stood before him. Jack, the voice came from everywhere and nowhere at once, a low, guttural rasp that seemed to vibrate through the walls. You cannot escape. Jack's breath came in shallow gasps, his chest heaving as the figure stepped closer. His legs refused to move, his body frozen in place by the sheer weight of the fear that gripped him. The creature loomed over him, its eyes burning with a cold, otherworldly fire, its skeletal hands reaching out toward him. "You summoned us," the voice whispered, its tone mocking. "You invited us in, and now we are here to claim what is ours." Jack tried to speak, tried to plead for mercy, but no words came. His throat was dry, his voice stolen by the terror that had wrapped itself around him like a vice. The creature's fingers brushed against Jack's skin, cold as ice, and in that moment Jack felt it, the darkness, the curse, seeping into him. It flowed through his veins like poison, filling him with a sense of overwhelming dread, of inevitable doom. The weight of it was unbearable, crushing him from the inside out. And then, with a sudden, violent jolt, the creature pulled Jack into the darkness. The land's final victim. The land lay quiet once more, untouched and forgotten. The winds that blew across the barren fields carried with them the faintest whispers of what had once been of the lives that had been lost, the dreams that had crumbled into dust. The trees stood silent, their branches twisted and gnarled, casting long, skeletal shadows across the ground. The house that had once been filled with the laughter and life of Jack and his brothers now stood empty, a hollow shell, its windows dark and lifeless. The ancestral shrine that was meant to secure their legacy was never built. The foundations, buried beneath the cursed earth, were long forgotten, swallowed by the very land they had sought to claim. And somewhere, deep within the shadows of the house, Jack remained trapped in the darkness he had unleashed, haunted by the spirits he had summoned. His family's legacy, once so full of promise, was lost forever, consumed by the greed and desperation that had led them to their downfall. The curse had claimed them all. The land, untouched and forsaken, would remain a monument to that dark truth for generations to come.